Hey there, I'm David Icke, and we're here to talk about writing. This is the last part of a series that I've been doing on the shape of a short story. We've been going through Dan Wells' 7-point plot system as a guide, and we borrowed a few ideas from Lester Dent's pulp paper master fiction plot. It's a lot of words to say in the right order. We've been talking about short stories specifically, but with a few modifications, these concepts could be used for stories of really any length, because it's a very traditional Western story form, and you can trace the basic shape of the form back to Aristotle. Now, as I keep saying, this isn't the only way to write a short story, okay? It's just one very good way. And if you just getting started, you want a good form to put your story into. So let's go through the pieces one by one. We're assuming a 6,000 word short story. And with that 6,000 words, we'll divide it into 4 quarters of 1,500 words each. We start with the first quarter, the hook. And the goal of the hook is to capture your reader's attention and make him care about the characters. So you introduce all the important characters, but not necessarily the villain if you have one. You make it clear what your protagonist wants. What does he desire? You introduce trouble early, and you bring in the opposing force that blocks your protagonist from his desire, and it leads him to the main conflict. Now, for the first half of your story, your protagonist is going to be reacting to events. So an easy trick to start your story with is just start your protagonist in the opposite state from the end. So what does he want? What's he going to get at the end? Start him at the opposite place. Each quarter of your story should have some sort of physical conflict. So that just means things are happening. People are moving around the stage in opposition to each other. It doesn't have to be a fist fight. Could be a fist fight. It could be a trade negotiation, an argument. It really just needs to be something that's active and physically embodied. You don't want disembodied heads talking in an empty room. No more of that. So each quarter has its own physical conflict, and make sure each one's a little different. So don't use 4 fist fights. Don't use 4 trade negotiations. Use a fist fight and a trade negotiation and 2 other things. Okay, so we've talked about the hook. We talked about the physical conflict. After the hook, we come to the first twist, which is the transition point between the first and second quarter. It's your last chance to introduce a new important character. The first twist should be some kind of surprising development, a secret reveal that makes matters worse for the protagonist, and it's going to draw him deeper into whatever mysteries that you have prepared for him. You will give him something extra special to react to in the next quarter. Now, twists are hard. There's some traps to avoid. You want to think about the story from your reader's perspective. What would he expect? That's the obvious. Don't use the obvious. You want to eliminate the obvious. Then, what would the reader hate? That's the odious. You want to eliminate the odious. Don't make your reader hate the story. Then, whatever possibilities are left, those are just surprises. Use whatever surprise makes the most sense and hits the protagonist hardest. You want to give your protagonist lots of trouble in your story. So the first twist doesn't need to be huge, just surprising. Most importantly, it needs to follow logically, and it needs to pull the protagonist deeper into the conflict. So once you have the twist, you can go back through the hook and plant some clues. You can plant some false clues. You can plant some true clues. For the true clues, a good trick is to put them into the action scene. So something that happens while your reader's distracted, so that maybe they don't pick up on it at first, but if they go back and look, they'll see, oh, wow, this guy's a genius. So keep it subtle. Always follow up on your promises. Now, after the first twist, we hit the first pinch point, where you start to really apply pressure to your protagonist and his allies. Now they're still reacting to the events of the hook and now to the first twist. Now it's time to give them some more trouble to react to. You want to think in terms of try-fail cycles. Your character is going to react to trouble by trying something, then he fails, or worse, he succeeds, and it draws him even deeper into trouble. Every scene needs to ask your characters a question, and the conclusion of the scene should be an answer to that question with either yes, but, or no, and furthermore. Why is that? Because those answers draw the protagonist deeper into the conflict and further into trouble. And that's what you want. You want your reader glued to his seat, trying to find out what's going to happen next. Because trouble is the key to your story, and especially to the second quarter, the pinch point. This is the point where that storm that was kind of threatening in the hook, this is now where it's going to break. Things need to go wrong. Now, in a short story, all the trouble needs to reflect the main conflict, because you don't really have room for anything else. Your main conflict, remember, is what your protagonist wants and why he can't have it. And that needs to be completely clear by this point. And then finally, somewhere in the pinch point, include that physical conflict and just make it different from the hook. Keep it interesting. Now, after the first pinch point, we hit the midpoint. That's the transition between the first and the second halves. And this is a really important transition because in the first half, your protagonist was reacting to events. Now, in the midpoint, he's going to learn or experience something that will force some kind of decision out of him. And what he decides is going to set the stage for the second half. Now, the first half, he's reactive. In the second half, he's going to become proactive. He's going to start taking action to solve the main conflict. And the midpoint's a great time for another twist, some kind of surprise development that's going to force a decision out of the protagonist. Just remember, eliminate the obvious, eliminate the odious, then go back and plant any necessary clues or red herrings so that everything follows logically. Now, the events of the midpoint can also give your protagonist some sort of key that he needs on his way to solving the main conflict. It's not the final key, but it's some piece of the puzzle that he needs to get to the final solution. And it needs to be, something that's going to help him along, help him make progress. It could be as simple as just that forced decision that he's forced to make. Whatever you do, make sure it follows logically from the first half. It needs to make sense. Now, past the midpoint, we enter the second half, the third quarter, and just to make the numbers more confusing, it's the second pinch point. Are you with me? The second pinch point is the mirror of the first pinch point. Storm should be raging at this point. You want to keep applying pressure to the protagonist and his friends. Remember, it's a pinch point. You're pinching your characters. Imagine a narrow gap that they have to get through to get on to the resolution. So your protagonist is taking action now, and he's making some sort of headway towards resolving the conflict, but plans go awry. If your protagonist has a mentor, this is a great time to remove the mentor, and then it's time to make the stakes of the conflict clear. What will the consequences be if your protagonist fails? As you put your protagonist through more of those try-fail cycles, each scene answer should make the stakes more clear. And again, trouble reflects the main conflict. That's, especially in a short story, you don't have room for anything else. Nothing's going right for your protagonist. He's losing his support. If he doesn't catch a break soon, he is headed for defeat. In the midst of all the trouble, make sure you include some sort of physical conflict. It's pretty natural if you're really throwing trouble at your protagonist. And again, just make it different from the hook and the first pinch point. Now, all this trouble, all that conflict is going to lead you to the big setback, and that's the transition point between the third and the fourth quarters. This is going to lead us into the resolution. Now, the big setback is where you really wallop your protagonist upside the head, kick his legs out from under him, and you're going to leave him alone and stripped of all support. This is a great time for another twist, of course. Again, eliminate the obvious, eliminate the odious, and then pick a surprise that really, really goes for the throat. But also, in the twist, somehow you want to put some kind of final key that the protagonist needs to solve the conflict. Because in the midst of that biggest setback of all, he's finally going to obtain the capability to overcome the main conflict. And the key could be as simple as confidence or determined resolution, or it could be some piece of information he needs. Once you have the twist, you can go back through the first three quarters, plant any clues you need to, any false leads. Just make sure it all makes sense. Finally, we reach the last quarter of the story, the resolution. It is not easy to stick the landing, so you want to take extra care here. You start the last quarter by shoveling the difficulty and the challenge on as thick as you can. The darker and more violent this storm gets, the greater the contrast is going to be when the storm passes and the new day dawns. I'm having trouble speaking this morning. Now, if your story has a villain, this is where he and the protagonist need to have their big showdown. You definitely want some sort of physical conflict here. And it needs to be, again, different from whatever you had in the last three quarters. Now, there's a temptation here. You may be tempted to send in the cavalry too early. You want to rescue your protagonist. He's having a really hard time. But no, don't do it yet. He needs to rescue himself. In this form of story we're talking about, he really needs to take that action for himself to get himself out of this predicament. You can give him help, but he needs to be the initiator and the leader here. Because we're past the midpoint and your protagonist is now proactively trying to solve the conflict. This is not the time to make him passive again. That will just make the ending fall flat, trust me. Now, remember Lester Dent's question. Did God kill the villain or did the hero? Don't steal your hero's victory away from him. Now, once he's triumphed, it's time for any final necessary revelations. Depending on your genre, you may not want to reveal too much, but you definitely need to make good on any promises you've made along the way. The goal of the resolution is to have your reader finish the story with a warm, satisfied feeling. A good way to assist that is to end with a really good snappy punchline. And I can't give you a formula for that. It needs to emerge pretty organically from the story and from the character arc, and it needs to pull the character and the plot together into one pithy line that just has that to it. So take your time to get it right. There's an author, Dean Wesley Smith, who suggests writing past the ending until you get stuck, basically. Just keep going until you run out of things to say. Then go back over what you wrote and find where the actual ending is, where that snappy punchline could be, and then cut the rest off and throw it away. And that's okay. You can write words and throw them away. That's perfectly fine. You're the author. You're in control. So that is it for the shape of a story. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey. I hope you found it helpful. I know when I learned this stuff, it was like a revelation to me. It totally changed how I write stories. Now, if you found this helpful, please do hit the thumbs up button down there. And if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel, please. And then finally, I have a question for you. What do you like to see in a story? What kind of stories do you like? Do you like the adventures that end with a happy ending, or do you like tragedies and that end poorly for the protagonists? Let me know down in the comments. Also, if you think I missed anything in this series, please let me know down there as well. And I will look forward to hearing your comments. And until then, keep writing.